Today we're going to be discussing Canadian Surgeon Frederick Banting. This is a presentation created by Randy Swain. Frederick Banting was born on November 14, 1891 in Ontario, Canada, as the youngest of 5 children. He went on to live a life of service and died at 49 years old while serving as a liaison officer between the British and North American Medical Service. As Shakespeare once said, "What's in a name?" Well, with a name like Sir Frederick Grant Banting, KBE, MC, FRS, FRSC, there must be a lot behind it because that is a lot of acronyms. Let's break it down together. KBE is the rank of Knight Commander. Frederick Grant Banting was knighted by King George V. Banting was the first Canadian to be knighted after the First World War and one of the last Canadians ever. The MC means he received an award as a physician in the Medical Corps of the Canadian Army. The FRS means he was a part of the Fellowship of the Royal Society. Now, the Royal Society is a self-governing fellowship made up of the most eminent scientists, engineers, and technologists from the UK and the Commonwealth. More specifically, he was a fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry, which is where the FRSC comes from. He was known as a physician, a surgeon, an army officer, medical researcher, a Nobel Laureate, and an artist. We live for but a moment. This was said by Marcus Aurelius, and nothing is truer of Frederick Banting's lifestyle. He led a short life of 49 years, but the depth of his life was incredibly inspiring. Banting dropped out of college initially while studying general arts because he was not able to pass all of his subjects. Then he decided he could go to medical school, which seems kind of crazy to me. In total, he attended 3 different institutions and eventually obtained multiple degrees, including a medical degree, despite the fact that previously he had struggled with his studies. Most of his life was spent serving his country within the Canadian Army Medical Corps. He dabbled in medical research, but eventually began practicing as a general practitioner and surgeon. He found that in the beginning, patients were few and far between. Therefore, he began work as a demonstrator of surgery and anatomy at the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Western Ontario. Even after taking on this additional endeavor, he worried about his financial state until he made a major discovery that would eventually lead to a Nobel Prize. Interestingly enough, during the research for that Nobel Prize, his practice began to take off as well. Eventually, he returned to medical research within the Canadian Medical Corps and continued a life of service until he met his end. Service to others is the rent you pay for your room here on earth, was said by Muhammad Ali, but you can tell this was how Banting led his life. Banting's military service was not only the majority of the depth of his life, but it seems to be where he found the most joy. As part of the Canadian Army Medical Corpsmen, he wore many hats. He spent 13 months as a surgeon in a Canadian hospital in England. Afterward, he traveled to France, where he worked on the front lines as a battalion medical officer for a little less than a year. This short tour was due to the fact that he was hit by shrapnel during the attack on Cambrai and evacuated. Due to his conduct during action, he was awarded the Military Cross. The Military Cross seen here is an award given when one exhibits an act or acts of exemplary gallantry during active operations against the enemy on land to all members of any rank in the armed forces. Banting took a break from his military service and then eventually returned. Upon his return, he did significant research with chemical warfare while anticipating the need for retaliation against Adolf Hitler. This research included self-wounding with mustard gas to test antidotes that he was manipulating at home. During this Battle of Britain, Banting began to greatly miss his role as a battalion medical officer. The opportunity arose to replace one of his estranged colleagues on a research liaison mission, and Banting gallantly took the opportunity. In his hurry to get there, he took a chance to travel on a bomber being ferried across the North Atlantic. Unfortunately, this would be Banting's last flight. Shortly after leaving Newfoundland, the pilot reported that he needed to turn around due to an engine failure on the two-engine aircraft. The second engine failed shortly after, and Banting was mortally injured in the crash. While Banting was researching the pancreas to improve a lecture for his students, he came across an article that sparked a fascination with diabetes. The night he found the article, he wrote down a research idea, and you can see that entry here. Although it's a little hard to read, it reads, diabetes, ligate pancreatic ducts of dog. Keep dogs alive till acini degenerate, leaving isolates. Try to isolate the internal secretion of these to relieve glycosuria. He presented this concept to colleagues, who then turned him towards the professor of physiology at the University of Toronto, John James Rickard MacLeod. MacLeod told Banting that the concept may be worth pursuing, but at high risk of failing, as had many other more experienced researchers before him. Banting was undeterred by these statements, and MacLeod offered to provide the animals and facilities so that the research could be completed, as well as the student assistants to aid in the process. One of those assistants being Charles Best. The research was daunting and slow going, but undeterred yet, despite his desire to go back to his military service, Banting, alongside Charles Best, overcame the death of many lab animals and a multitude of other setbacks. Another setback was that Banting feared all of his work would be attributed to someone else because there were so many hands in the pot. Banting wanted to be sure he was given credit where credit was due because he believed he was the discoverer of insulin, first as the man whose idea led to the discovery, and secondly as the conductor of the animal experiments which he believed had proven the presence of the substance. Banting was so fearful of losing credit for his discovery. In fact, he physically fought a biochemist, Dr. J. Bertram Collip, who was helping to purify the extract for human use. Ultimately, it was agreed upon that they would use alphabetical order to list the names on the project, thus putting Banting's name at the forefront. Soon after the agreement, Banting's assistant Best had discovered a more stable form of producing insulin for human consumption, which have actually led to Collip's participation being obsolete. Shortly thereafter, Banting launched into a private practice for treating diabetes with insulin. Bliss states, by the end of 1922, it was clear that insulin's impact in the treatment of diabetes was dazzling, and the discovery was almost universally hailed as a triumph of modern medicine. And in the autumn of 1923, it was announced that Banting and J.J.R. MacLeod would share that year's Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the discovery of insulin. Banting was only 31, and this declared him not only the first Canadian laureate, but the youngest at the time. The facility that Banting was provided to conduct those much-needed experiments that led to his Nobel Prize needed significant work. Banting is quoted saying, "The place where we were operating was not fit to be called an operating room. Aseptic work had not been done in it for some years. The floor could not be scrubbed properly or the water would go through on the laboratories below." Many of the animals' deaths during the experiments were due to the inability to perform asepsis and the consequences therein. Banting highly encouraged aseptic technique with statements such as, "Especially during the hot weather, we have been so greatly hampered by infections, despite our utmost care. And since we have lost so many dogs, I strongly desire more help to keep the place clean, and gloves, and gowns, and a thorough fitting up of our operating room." Here you can see Frederick Banting, along with his assistant Charles Best, with one of the first diabetic dogs to receive insulin. When the insulin was provided to diabetic dogs, they were not necessarily cured, but they were found to live longer. This was just the beginning of his long endeavor with insulin. Banting once said, "Insulin is not a cure for diabetes, it is a treatment. It enables the diabetic to burn sufficient carbohydrates so that proteins and fats may be added to the diet in sufficient quantities to provide energy for the economic burdens of life." Believe it or not, Banting was also an artist. He found peace in painting during his divorce. He was primarily known for painting landscapes. The painting shown here is his most well-known painting called The Lab, which was sold in 2018 for $236,862 with a buyer's premium of approximately $46,000. This buyer's premium was donated to further diabetes research, education, and patient care. This painting is an actual representation of his lab at 2 a.m. And on the left here, you can see a photo of his actual lab for comparison. Banting appears to be well-rounded on the surface, with his interest in science and art and his desire to serve. However, it seems in his family and social life is where you find his struggles. He is quoted once saying, "I had been taught that if I cried to be quiet about it, so whereas I never howled, the least thing made me cry, both at school and at home. Crying tends to separate a child from other children, for even children dislike a crybaby, and I had no friends in the world." Banting struggled in his social situations, and most friendships and relationships were relatively short-lived for the time period, when most friendships were lifelong and divorce was frowned upon. When it came to his love life, he was married first to Marion Wilson Robertson in 1924. They had a son, but divorced in 1932. The divorce was tumultuous. She accused him of adultery and abuse. He accused her of the same and denied paternity of their son. In 1939, he remarried to a woman named Henrietta Elizabeth Ball, who he had no children with, and she was with him until she was widowed in 1941. I hope you've enjoyed learning about Canadian surgeon Sir Frederick Grant Banting, KBE, MC, FRSC. With a background such as my own, I find his life not only fulfilling, but inspiring. I will leave you here with my resources and a quote from Frederick Banting himself. "I am a firm believer in the theory that you can do or be anything that you wish in this world within reason, if you are prepared to make the sacrifices, think, and work hard enough and long enough." Thank you for your time.